August 13th, 2018. 1:48 a.m. Frederick, Colorado. Shannon Watts, 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant, steps out of her friend Nicole Atkinson's car after a late flight from Arizona. A neighbor's surveillance camera catches her walking toward her front door. It would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. By 10 a.m., she is nowhere to be found. She misses her OB/GYN appointment, something her friends know she would never ignore. Calls go unanswered. Messages sit unopened. The unease grows heavier with every passing hour. At 1:40 p.m., Nicole drives back to Shannon's home. She finds the white Lexus in the garage. Inside the house, Shannon's purse, her phone, her medication, all untouched. Yet Shannon is gone. When Officer Scott Coonrod arrives for a welfare check, Chris Watts appears soon after. His voice, his posture, his explanations, all captured on bodycam. And in those recorded moments, suspicion begins to form. Because everything that belonged to Shannon was there. Everything, except Shannon herself. August 13th, 2018. The town of Frederick, Colorado, wakes to a still summer morning. But inside one home on Saratoga Trail, the silence is already pressing. Hours earlier, at 1:48 a.m., Shannon Watts returned from her business trip in Arizona. Her friend Nicole Atkinson had dropped her off after a late flight into Denver. A neighbor's security camera captured Shannon walking up to her front door. It would be the last time anyone saw her alive. By 10 a.m., concern was already building. Shannon never missed an appointment, especially not one with her OB/GYN, and she was scheduled that morning. She was 15 weeks pregnant with her third child, and her close friends knew how important this visit was to her. When she failed to show, calls went unanswered, messages were ignored, and her friend Nicole's worry turned to dread. By early afternoon, she drove to the Watts home to check on her. At 1:40 p.m., Nicole called Frederick police to request a welfare check. Officer Scott Coonrod was dispatched to the address. His body-worn camera documented every step. Inside the house, Shannon's white Lexus sat parked in the garage. Her purse was there. Her phone was there. Even her wedding ring was there. On the counter, her medications remained untouched. These were not the signs of a woman who had simply walked away. They were the belongings of someone who had intended to return but never got the chance. As Officer Coonrod surveyed the scene, Chris Watts arrived. He told the officer that Shannon had taken the girls to a friend's house. His words were calm, but the setting contradicted him. Every piece of Shannon's life was still inside that home, except for Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. Coonrod pressed for answers, but it was the neighbor next door who added a new layer of doubt. That neighbor was Nate Trinastick. He invited police into his living room to review footage from his surveillance system. On the screen, just before dawn, at 5:27 a.m., Nate's camera showed Chris backing his work truck into the driveway. To Nate, this was unusual. Chris normally parked the truck on the street, but that morning he positioned it right up against the garage, moving back and forth, loading items for several minutes. Watching the footage, Nate leaned closer and lowered his voice. "He's not acting right." Those 5 words captured what many had already started to feel. From the very first day, Chris's behavior raised questions. He spoke in measured tones, but something about his answers felt too neat, too thin. He repeated himself. He shifted from foot to foot. The details he offered did not align with the reality inside that house. For friends who had spent years with Shannon, the idea that she would vanish, leaving behind her car, her wedding ring, and her phone, was impossible to accept. Later that evening, the attention widened beyond Saratoga Trail. News cameras arrived. Reporters set up in front of the Watts home, and Chris stepped into the spotlight. His first public interview was broadcast across Colorado that night. Standing in the driveway, with his family missing less than 24 hours, Chris looked into the camera and spoke. "If you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, just please bring her back." It was meant to be a plea, but to viewers, it came across differently. His words lacked urgency. His tone lacked emotion. His body language, arms crossed, rocking gently on his feet, felt detached. For a man whose pregnant wife and 2 young daughters had just disappeared, his demeanor drew more suspicion than sympathy. The interview spread quickly across local and national outlets. Friends and strangers alike analyzed his every move, his phrasing, the way he shifted his weight as he spoke. The footage became a mirror. Some saw a desperate husband, others saw something colder. But within the walls of that Frederick neighborhood, where neighbors had already watched him load his truck at dawn, doubt had hardened into suspicion. As that first night closed, Shanann's purse, her phone, her ring, and her car still sat where they had been found. Her daughters were still missing, and the husband, who should have been the most frantic voice in the room, was now the calmest. In the quiet of August 13th, 2018, the search for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste had only just begun, but the seeds of mistrust were already deeply planted. August 14th, 2018. Less than 24 hours after Shanann Watts and her daughters, Bella and Celeste, were reported missing, the case had already expanded beyond Frederick police. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, were called in, a rare step so early in a disappearance. To investigators, that decision underscored how quickly the details had signaled something more than a routine missing persons report. The first fact was indisputable. Shanann hadn't left voluntarily. Officer Scott Coonrod's bodycam footage from the welfare check had captured her purse, her phone, her medication, and even her wedding ring inside the house. Her Lexus was parked in the garage. These items weren't just evidence, they were her lifelines. Shanann was a mother of two, pregnant with a third, and meticulous in her daily life. Walking away from her family, her car, and her scheduled OB/GYN appointment was unthinkable. Detectives knew early that the focus of the investigation had to be inside the Watts home. And the person who lived there alongside Shanann and the girls was Chris Watts. That afternoon, Chris sat for a series of voluntary interviews. He told investigators that Shanann had returned home from a business trip in the early hours of August 13th. He said they'd had an emotional but civil conversation. When he left for work around 5:15 a.m., he claimed Shanann and the girls were still asleep. According to Chris, when he came home later, they were gone. He suggested Shanann might have taken Bella and Celeste to a friend's house. He implied she may have left after their conversation about separating. His tone was measured, steady, almost detached. But investigators had already gathered enough from Shanann's circle to doubt those words. Her best friend, Nicole Atkinson, was adamant. Shanann would never walk out, especially without her phone and car. She had a medical condition, lupus, that required regular care and medication. And she had been excited about her pregnancy, sharing news with friends just days earlier that the baby was a boy. The portrait of Shanann that emerged from those closest to her was of a woman deeply rooted in her home, in her children, and in the life she was building. Chris's explanation didn't align with reality. The contradictions only deepened with the surveillance footage provided by the neighbor, Nate Trina-Stick. Nate's security camera had captured Chris on the morning of August 13th at 5:27 a.m., backing his work truck into the driveway. Chris usually parked on the street. That morning, he pulled the truck close to the garage and moved back and forth for nearly half an hour. Watching alongside investigators, Nate leaned toward them and whispered, "He's not acting right." To detectives, that clip was more than unusual behavior. It was a red flag in motion. Meanwhile, Chris continued to deny any wrongdoing. He told officers he had no idea where Shanann and the girls had gone. He denied harming them. When pressed about whether he was involved with another woman, he shook his head. "No, I'm not having an affair," he insisted. But by then, investigators were already digging into his phone records and financial history. They suspected he wasn't being truthful. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts to study Chris's interviews and public statements. They dissected the way he spoke, the way he moved, and what he didn't say. On the afternoon of August 14th, Chris stood in front of local news cameras and delivered his first public plea. He told reporters, "If you're out there, just come back. If somebody has her, just please bring her back." His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his body swayed gently back and forth, and his eyes darted instead of locking on the camera. His words were flat, his tone almost casual. For a man whose pregnant wife and two little girls had vanished, there was no urgency, no anguish. To many watching at home, the plea rang hollow. Friends noticed too. Nicole, the woman who had called police, later said she knew immediately something wasn't right. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razusek, were watching events unfold from North Carolina. To them, Chris's calmness was incomprehensible. They wanted answers, but every time Chris spoke, The distance between his words and the facts grew wider. Inside the investigation, the inconsistencies were now undeniable. Shannon hadn't driven away. She hadn't walked away. She hadn't left of her own choice. And if she hadn't, then the focus shifted squarely to the man who last admitted seeing her, Chris Watts. Still, detectives knew they had to tread carefully. They had suspicions, but suspicions weren't enough. They needed evidence, and they needed to confront Chris in a way that would break through his steady front. Experienced agents recognized the pattern. Cases like this often hinged on pressing a suspect just hard enough, confronting them with undeniable facts, and waiting for the lies to collapse under their own weight. By the end of August 14th, the plan was taking shape. Investigators would continue their search for Shannon, Bella, and Celeste, canvassing fields, questioning friends, and reviewing surveillance. But they would also tighten the focus on Chris. His truck, his phone records, his financial behavior, his movements that morning. Every detail would be scrutinized, every inconsistency logged. For the small town of Frederick, the idea that Chris Watts, husband, father, familiar neighbor, could be at the center of his family's disappearance was almost too much to comprehend. Outwardly, he appeared cooperative, answering questions, standing in front of cameras. But inwardly, investigators were already convinced the story he was telling didn't hold. August 14th ended with more questions than answers, but one thing was now clear. Shannon and the girls had not simply vanished into the summer air. Something had happened to them, and Chris Watts knew more than he was saying. The time for patience was over. The FBI and CBI were ready to push harder. August 15th, 2018. By the third day of the investigation, local officers were no longer working alone. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, had joined Frederick Police inside their small station, and the focus of attention was now squarely on Chris Watts. After 2 days of shifting explanations and suspicious behavior, investigators decided the time had come for a polygraph test. FBI Special Agent Tammy Lee, a veteran interviewer with years of experience, was the one chosen to administer the exam. She explained the process to Chris carefully. The machine would record his heart rate, his breathing, his perspiration. She reminded him that the test was highly accurate, and that lying would only make things worse. Chris agreed without hesitation. He signed the paperwork, attached the sensors, and appeared calm. The exam began with routine, baseline questions, then moved to the ones investigators needed answered. Agent Lee asked, "Did you physically cause Shannon's disappearance?" Chris replied, "No," she asked. "Are you lying about the last time you saw Shannon?" Chris answered, "No," she asked. "Do you know where Shannon is now?" Once again, Chris said, no. His answers were firm, his voice steady, but the sensors told a different story. When the test was complete, Chris waited quietly, still showing little outward emotion. But the data was clear. Agent Lee returned to the room with the results and looked him in the eye. "Chris," she said, "you did not pass the polygraph. This is the time to be honest." That moment shifted the entire investigation. Chris denied again, saying the machine must have been wrong. He repeated that he hadn't lied. But his words were weaker now, his voice quieter, his gaze drifting away from the investigators in front of him. Detectives entered the room to reinforce the findings. They reminded Chris that Shannon's phone, her purse, her wedding ring, and her car were still at the house. They told him that neighbor Nate trying to stick his surveillance camera had already shown him backing his truck into the driveway at 5:27 a.m. on August 13th, something he didn't normally do. The evidence was piling up, and now the polygraph had exposed deception on top of it. Agent Lee leaned closer, urging him to think of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. "The time to be honest is right now," she told him. She explained that if something had happened in the heat of the moment, now was the time to explain it. Chris shifted in his chair, rubbed his hands together, and finally said he wanted to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts. Investigators allowed it, watching carefully from outside the room. The request marked the first crack in his story, the first sign that Chris Watts could no longer keep the truth contained. For 2 days he had insisted to officers, friends, neighbors, and cameras that he knew nothing about Shannon's disappearance. But the failed polygraph changed everything. It was the moment when Chris Watts' story began to collapse, and when investigators knew they were finally closing in on the truth. August 15th, 2018. Chris Watts sat in a small interrogation room at the Frederick Police Department. Hours earlier, FBI Special Agent Tammy Lee had told him directly, "Chris, you did not pass the polygraph. This is the time to be honest." Sitting alongside her were FBI Special Agent Graham Coder and Frederick Police Detective Dave Baumhover. Together, they began confronting Chris with the inconsistencies in his story. They reminded him that Shanann's purse, phone, and medication were still inside the house. Her Lexus was still in the garage. They told him Shanann would never voluntarily leave her daughters, Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3. They confronted him with neighbor Nate trying to stick his surveillance footage showing Chris at 5:27 a.m. on August 13th, backing his Anadarko work truck into the driveway and making repeated trips to and from the garage. Each point chipped away at the story Chris had been repeating since Monday. Chris shifted in his seat. His voice faltered as he continued to deny harming his family. Finally, he said quietly, "Can I talk to my dad?" Detectives allowed it. His father, Ronnie Watts, had flown in from North Carolina. The two sat alone in the interrogation room, though the recording equipment remained on. Chris leaned forward, lowered his voice, and told his father a new version of events. "Dad, I don't want to protect her." Ronnie looked at him, confused. Chris whispered, "She hurt the girls. And then I killed her." Chris claimed that he and Shanann had argued that morning about separating. He told Ronnie that Shanann strangled Bella and Celeste in their beds, and that in a rage he strangled her. It was the first time Chris admitted to killing Shanann, but it was also a lie, an attempt to shift blame onto his pregnant wife. Ronnie sat in stunned silence, absorbing the words. Detectives re-entered the room. Graham Coder asked, "So you're saying Shanann hurt the girls, and then you killed her?" Chris nodded, repeating his claim. He insisted, "I didn't hurt them. Shanann did." Investigators knew this didn't align with Shanann's character. She was 15 weeks pregnant with a son they had already named Nico. She had spent the weekend on a Thrive business trip, texting friends about Chris acting distant. She adored Bella and Celeste. Nothing in her life suggested she would harm them. They pressed further. "Where are Shanann and the kids now?" After a long pause, Chris finally told them, "They're at a site. Survey 319. Survey 319 was an isolated oil field owned by Anadarko Petroleum, where Chris worked as an operator. It was about 40 miles from Frederick, near Roggen, Colorado. Chris said Shanann was buried in a shallow grave near the site. Bella and Celeste, he admitted, had been placed in separate crude oil storage tanks. For investigators, it was a breakthrough. For Shanann's family, the Razuseks, who had been praying from North Carolina, it was devastating. The faint hope that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste might still be alive was gone. Chris Watts, the man who had pleaded on television 2 days earlier, "If you're out there, just come back," had admitted he killed his wife and disposed of his entire family at his worksite. Even in confession, Chris continued to lie, refusing to take responsibility for the deaths of his daughters. But the location was enough. Teams were immediately dispatched to Survey 319 to begin recovery. That night, August 15th, ended with Chris Watts under arrest. The case was no longer a search for missing persons. It was now a homicide investigation, and the nation would soon learn what detectives already knew. The perfect family portrait had been shattered by the man who created it. August 15th, 2018. Less than 72 hours after Shanann Watts was first reported missing, the case reached its breaking point. That night, after failing a polygraph test administered by FBI Special Agent Tammy Lee, Chris Watts admitted in a recorded conversation with his father, Ronnie Watts, that Shanann was dead. He told Ronnie that Shanann had strangled their daughters, Bella and Celeste, and that he killed her in response. Detectives immediately noted the lie, but the admission that Shanann was dead and that her body had been moved was enough to obtain arrest and search warrants. Detectives Tammy Lee, Graham Coder, and Dave Baumhover confronted Chris again. He repeated that Shanann had harmed the children, and he had strangled her after an argument. He finally revealed where he had taken them, a remote Anadarko Petroleum oil site where he worked, known as Survey 319, located outside Roggen, Colorado. According to Chris, Shanann was buried in a shallow grave near the site, while Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, had been placed in separate crude oil storage tanks. Late that night, police formally arrested Chris Watts. At approximately 11:30 p.m., he was handcuffed at the Frederick Police Department and transported to Weld County Jail in Greeley, Colorado. Booking records show he was held on suspicion of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Jail officials immediately placed him in protective custody, given the charges involved the murder of children and a pregnant woman. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Frederick community. Only a day earlier, Chris had appeared on Denver's 7 and local news stations, standing on his front porch and pleading for his family's safe return. Now, the same man was charged with killing them. That contradiction dominated headlines across the state and soon the country. Outlets like the Denver Post, CNN, and NBC reported late into the night that Chris Watts, the husband who had begged for his family's return, was in custody for their murders. For Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzusek, and her brother, Frankie Rzusek Jr., the news was devastating. From their home in North Carolina, they had been holding on to hope that Shanann and the girls would be found alive. After learning of Chris's confession and arrest, Frankie Jr. posted publicly, defending his sister and condemning Chris's story. He wrote that Shanann was a loving mother who had been excited to welcome her unborn son, Nico, and that Chris was lying to save himself. In Frederick, Shanann's close friend Nicole Atkinson, the one who had first noticed Shanann missed her OB/GYN appointment and had called police for the welfare check, learned that her instincts had been right. She told reporters later that she had never believed Shanann would leave her daughters or miss a medical appointment. The confirmation of Chris's arrest and confession brought her no relief, only grief. By the end of August 15th, Chris Watts was booked into Weld County Jail, held without bond. The search for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste shifted from a missing persons investigation to a recovery operation. With warrants in hand, law enforcement prepared to search Survey 319 the next morning. In less than 3 days, the picture of a perfect family in Frederick had shattered. The case that began with a welfare check by Officer Scott Coonrod on August 13th at 1:40 p.m. was now a homicide investigation. And the next step, recovering Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico from the remote oil site where Chris had taken them, would confirm the horror of what investigators already feared. August 16th, 2018. Detectives, CBI agents, and recovery teams arrived at Survey 319, an Anadarko petroleum site near Roggen, Colorado. This was the location Chris Watts had pointed to after failing his polygraph the night before. Officers carried warrants, shovels, and recovery equipment, fully aware that they were no longer searching for missing persons, but recovering homicide victims. The site was isolated, surrounded by dirt roads and farmland. 2 massive crude oil storage tanks towered over the property. Nearby, investigators spotted disturbed soil. Digging carefully, they found the body of Shanann Watts, 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant, with her son, Nico Lee Watts. She had been buried in a shallow grave, less than 2 feet deep, covered hastily with earth. Attention turned to the tanks. At the top, sealed hatches led to dark openings filled with petroleum. Recovery specialists opened them and discovered the bodies of Bella Watts, age 4, and Celeste Watts, age 3. Each girl had been placed in a separate oil tank. The work to recover them was slow and painstaking, requiring hours due to the hazardous conditions of crude oil. Detectives and coroner's staff who participated later described it as one of the most difficult and haunting recoveries they had ever undertaken. By that evening, the Weld County coroner confirmed that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste had been located and removed from the site. The recovery ended all hope that the family might be alive. For Frank and Sandra Rzusek, Shanann's parents in North Carolina, and for her brother Frankie Rzusek Jr., the confirmation was devastating but expected. Frankie Jr. posted publicly on Facebook that night, calling Chris a liar and defending his sister as a loving mother who would never hurt her children. August 21st, 2018. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke formally filed charges against Chris Watts. He faced 9 felony counts, 5 counts of first-degree murder, 2 for each child under 12, 1 for Shanann. 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for unborn son Nico. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. At the press conference, Rourke told reporters the case reflected the ultimate betrayal of a family by the one person who was supposed to keep them safe. The charges carried the possibility of the death penalty under Colorado law. November 6, 2018. Chris Watts appeared in Weld County Court. In a plea agreement reached between the prosecution and defense, he pleaded guilty to all 9 counts. In exchange, the death penalty was removed from consideration. District Attorney Rourke explained that the decision not to pursue capital punishment was supported by Shanann's family, who did not want years of appeals. The Razuseks said they preferred certainty, that Chris would spend the rest of his life in prison with no chance of parole. November 19, 2018. Sentencing day. The Weld County courtroom was filled with reporters, investigators, and family members. District Attorney Rourke laid out the facts. Chris strangled Shanann in their Frederick home, smothered Bella and Celeste, and then loaded all 3 into his work truck to drive them to Survey 319. Rourke revealed Bella's final words before she died. "Daddy, no." The details silenced the courtroom. Shanann's family gave their impact statements. Frank Razusek called Shanann a wonderful daughter and said she had loved Chris deeply. Sandra Razusek said through tears that she forgave Chris because her faith required it, even though she could never understand his actions. Frankie Razusek Jr. spoke with anger and grief, calling Chris a heartless monster and defending his sister as a devoted mother. When invited to speak, Chris declined. He sat silently, showing no emotion. Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Chris Watts to 5 life sentences, 3 consecutive, 2 concurrent, without the possibility of parole. 48 years for the unlawful termination of pregnancy. 36 years for tampering with bodies. In total, Chris Watts received life in prison plus 84 years. Judge Kopkow told him, "The magnitude of your crimes is beyond measure. You have no right to ever set foot in free society again." Chris was transferred to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, where he remains incarcerated. The Watts case moved with unprecedented speed. From the welfare check at 2,825 Saratoga Trail on August 13th to Chris's sentencing on November 19th, just over 3 months had passed. Within 72 hours of the first police response, Chris was under arrest. The case showed how vigilance and evidence exposed the truth. Nicole Atkinson's call to police after Shanann missed her OB/GYN appointment sparked the investigation. Officer Scott Coonrod's bodycam captured Chris's strange behavior and the critical detail that Shanann's belongings were still inside the house. Neighbor Nate Trinestica's surveillance camera provided video that contradicted Chris's timeline. FBI Special Agent Tammy Lee's polygraph forced him into a corner he couldn't escape. And detectives like Graham Coder and Dave Baumhover pressed relentlessly until the lies collapsed. The deaths of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico stunned a nation, not only because of their brutality, but because of the speed with which the truth was uncovered. It was a case that revealed the darkness hidden behind the facade of a perfect family, and one that proved determined law enforcement can bring justice swiftly, even when confronted with deception.